Gary, what do you think is the biggest mistake a screenwriter can make?
I don't know about the biggest mistake a writer can make. There are a lot of mistakes writers can and do make. One of them is being a bit inebriated and too grand about their work in the way they communicate it to the world. No one wants to, people want to discover, they want to be Columbus discovering the new world. And if you overstate the new world and that you've already developed and built hotels and what they're going to find and they should come, and it takes all the fun out of being the Christopher Columbus. So I would say be authentic, be persuasive, but don't overstate. I think another mistake that writers can make is believing that other people know more than you, believing that other people know the right way to do things or a better way to do things. It's like, no. You know yourself, you know your project better than anyone, and you should, if you check with your gut and your brain both, be fully capable and competent to figure out the best way to put that out into the market and market it and tell the story around it. No one can be you. I think there are a lot of mistakes that writers can make. One of them is wasting time and not being as disciplined as they should be about their output. One of them is certainly thinking that there's such a thing as perfection. Hogwash. There's a point at which I know people who've been rewriting a book or a script or something for literally years, plural, and that's not a good sign. So I think there's, look, all of us are capable of making lots of different kinds of mistakes. I think common sense sort of is the answer to most of them.
Well, Susan Cain, she's an attorney, and she wrote Quiet. Yeah, and she talked about how she took 7 years, I think, to work on the book, but she loved the process, and that was part of her being an introvert, and that's what the book is about, is just delving into sort of this her own little world and writing and researching, and all of that was so seductive to her, whereas knowing that she had to get it out there, well, that was something that's the total sort of
horror.
It's horror to introverts. We cringe at that stuff.
Everyone's different. There's, you're asking me, by the nature of an interview, you're asking me questions that are as broadly applicable, hopefully, as they can be. And, what's true of Susan Cain or J.K. Rowling or this one or that one is not going to be true for 90% of the audience. But yeah, the thing about a Susan Cain and certain others is they kept genuinely enhancing and improving and putting more meat on the bone. Susan didn't waste the last 3 years out of those 7 years just cuddling her manuscript, right? That wasn't her process. But most people who spend 7 years on anything, I can almost guarantee you, have wasted a lot of time.
Right.
It's very individual.
Well, just wrapping up, just quickly, you had said something earlier about, the person who's too grandiose versus then the person who thinks that everyone else knows more than they. And David and I happen to be having a very similar conversation in the car about how there's just kind of almost like two types of people. And I've said it before in interviews. But finding that middle ground, because you know the braggart, the one this is the next best thing, and that person's usually at a cocktail party and that's the one you move away from. And then the one that probably has a lot of really interesting things to say, but you can't get it out of them because they don't believe in themselves and they're closed off, their arms are closed, and it's almost like they want to go into a corner. So how do we find that middle balance? Because I think a lot of times these personality types don't know that they are that way. And I think if you could take that braggart and make them take them down on the scale.
I'd rather take the quiet one and make them talk a little more.
Make them more grandiose?
Yeah, because I can guarantee it. The person who's, and I get this a lot, and here's the good news, it's not just a script, it's a trilogy, and guess what, I've already figured out the merchandising, and guess what, it's guaranteed to make $100 million at the box office. You are so lucky that I'm offering you this project. It's like, please, get out of my inbox. That's never going to happen. I remember Lily Tartikoff, after Brandon Tartikoff died, who was almost unparalleled in for who he was and how people embraced him. He was beloved. Everything about him, his intelligence, his creativity, his personality, his very down-to-earth, quiet ways, charming, and created the most successful network in the history of television and brought more innovation to bear than anyone who had come before. And I remember Lily Tartikoff in an interview talking about she met him at this big party. I think it was at Lou Wasserman's or some big person's home. And everybody else was very, in the moment. And there was this one guy, very quiet guy, off in the corner, sort of keeping to himself, really not talking. And she just zeroed in on him and said, "That's the one," right? And went over and met him, and sure enough, right? J.F. Lawton was the same way. I met Lawton not because he was a writer. I hired him to program my Macintosh, which was, like in the mid-'80s. It was one of the first ones, and you couldn't plug the sucker in. It didn't do anything. And a writer friend of mine happened to use the Mac, and I asked, who programmed that? And she said, "This guy." I called this guy, and it was J.F. Lawton. He literally sat by my side, worked in my office nonstop for 3 weeks, programming, learning everything about my life, what I did, how I did it, what I wanted, what I needed. He knew everything about it. So he knew my work, but he never mentioned that he was a writer. He had 7 scripts sitting in his little one-room studio. He was that quiet, brilliant, shy guy who was he was so gifted it was ridiculous. But you had to pull it out of him. And I did. But you have to sort of just notice things. There's this wonderful Daniel Goleman, who wrote Emotional Intelligence, gave a talk, and he talks about, I forget what campus, it was a campus back east, somewhere in the United States, where they have a seminary as well. And they did an experiment. And in this experiment, they divided the seminary students into 2 groups. And they told both groups that they were going to develop and deliver that same day a sermon. But to the control group A, they said, on any topic of your choosing. But to control group B, they said, you're going to deliver a sermon based on the parable of the Good Samaritan. Well, we all know the parable of the Good Samaritan. So they were both sent off to spend a certain amount of time crafting their sermon. And after a certain amount of time, they were told, okay, it's time to leave. We're going to go to the chapel, which is the far side of the campus. And they were going to walk these curving walkways across campus to the chapel. And so they did. But along the path, right off the walkway, on the lawn, writhing in fetal position, was a somewhat older man, obviously in bad shape, in pain. The study was to see how many and which students stopped and why. And those who didn't stop, why didn't they stop? One would logically think that those who stopped were the ones who were writing the parable about the parable of the Good Samaritan, because that was their mindset. But that wasn't at all true. What was true is that of those who stopped and those who didn't, there was one consistent reality. The students who did not feel prepared, who were anxious, who were consumed, who were not ready to deliver their sermon, who were lost in their thoughts about what am I going to do, they didn't notice this person on the ground. They literally didn't notice. And so they continued along the walkway. The students who felt ready, confident, self-contained about this idea, they walked and they were observing and noticing everything around them because they were free and present. And they noticed this man on the ground writhing in pain, and they stopped. had nothing to do with the Good Samaritan. It had to do with the fact that we in the modern age notice so much less because we're so busy on so many levels that we miss a lot of life. We miss opportunity, we miss people, we miss community, we miss so much just because we don't notice. I would say there's a lesson in there for those who aspire to a creative career. But I wouldn't say that to them.